He invested $10.5 million in it, and a decade later, he sold it for 100, not 100,000, but for exactly 4 25-cent coins. Inside remained an organ that cost as much as an entire street of houses, 600 tons of structural steel, tons of the rarest Italian marble. He began building this palace on October 29, 1929, the day the American economy collapsed. But the craziest part is, you know this house. Millions of people have seen it in the famous movie Annie. However, behind this fairy tale facade lies a story built on the fear of some and the poverty of others. I will tell you how this monument to greed became a symbol of hope and why the name of its true architect was erased from history. In 1982, America fell in love with a house. To the sound of the song, "I Think I'm Gonna Like It Here," a little red-headed orphan ran through its endless halls, marble floors, and gilded staircases. It was the mansion of Daddy Warbucks, a symbol of boundless wealth, but wealth with a kind heart. A place where the most impossible American dream became a reality. This house remains a place where dreams are born today. But these are very different dreams, and they belong not to fictional orphans, but to thousands of real students hurrying to lectures down the very same corridors. Because this house was indeed a dream, but not just one, two. The dream of two of the most ruthless and ambitious capitalists of their era. Their names were John McCall and Hubert Parson, and they built their empires on two unshakable pillars of the American economy: fear and poverty. The first, John McCall, was the president of an insurance company. He erected his palace on the middle class's fear of sudden death. Every dollar set aside by ordinary people for a rainy day, he turned into an instrument for risky games on Wall Street. This molding was paid for by their anxiety. The second, Hubert Parson, inherited and expanded the fortune of a five-and-dime store empire. He built his Versailles on their desperate poverty. Every cent saved from the salaries of thousands of shopgirls turned into another stone for his palace. So how did this building, born of cynicism and excessive pride, become a symbol of hope and knowledge? How did a monument to personal power turn into a public treasure loved by millions today? To answer this question, we need to look deeper. We need to excavate the foundation, poured not only with tons of concrete, but also with a series of compromises, scandals, and human tragedies. The story of this house is a story of how creations can outgrow their creators, and about the price that has to be paid for it. At first glance, these were two completely different worlds. One, a world of muted light, expensive leather, and the quiet ticking of a stock telegraph. Here, in the headquarters of the New York Life Insurance Company, John McCall decided fates. Insurance in that era was almost a religion. People entrusted it with their last savings, buying a promise of security for their families. It was a sacred contract, built on the mathematics of fear. But for McCall, these mathematics had another, hidden side. Under his leadership, the money of widows and orphans, intended for future payouts, was turned into an aggressive investment fund. Millions of dollars flowed from the company's accounts to Wall Street, playing risky games with stocks and bonds. The profits settled in the pockets of the management. To ensure the system ran smoothly, McCall had a special tool, the famous yellow envelope. It always contained cash. For journalists willing to write a laudatory article, for politicians willing to lobby for a favorable law. He even created a fictitious account for his own son, through which the most questionable income was laundered. Every bas-relief on the facade of his future home was cast from this capital, a capital born from the betrayal of trust. The other world was the complete opposite, bright, noisy, chaotic. It was the universe of the Woolworth stores, managed by Hubert Parson. Here, small change jingled, shoppers crowded, and it seemed the American dream was being sold for 5 and 10 cents apiece. But behind this facade of consumer democracy hid a brutal underside. The Woolworth empire was held up by an army of girls in identical aprons. They worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Their salary in the 20s ranged from $10 to $15 a week, a sum that teetered on the brink of survival. The company policy, inherited by Parson from the founder, was cynical and simple. Pay just enough so they wouldn't starve, but not enough so they could leave. Every nickel squeezed from their youth and saved from their wages went toward the construction of the palace. Every marble fireplace was a silent witness to thousands of hours of their grueling labor. 2 rivers of capital. One, dark and clandestine, was fed by fear of the future. The other, dazzlingly bright, was fed by the poverty of the present. And both flowed to a single point on the map, to merge in the foundation of one grand and defiant structure. The land remembers. Before becoming a canvas for others' ambitions, this plot on the New Jersey coast was a quiet citadel of the Anglo-Saxon establishment. Old money, old names, old rules. And then, at the turn of the century, John McCall invades, the son of Irish immigrants, a Catholic, an upstart. He didn't knock on their door. He kicked it down, buying the best plot of land. His first shadow lawn was an architectural scream, a massive seaside villa in the shingle style. It wasn't a subtle hint, but a punch in the face. This style, American to the core, was a statement. I'm not trying to be one of you. I'm here to show that I'm richer than you. His house didn't try to imitate. It tried to dominate, overwhelming everything around it with its size and ostentatious luxury. Decades later, on the very same ashes, stood another man, Hubert Parson. His motivation was different, more complex. His enemy wasn't another class, but the ghost of his own father-in-law, Frank Woolworth, the man who built the tallest skyscraper in the world. Parson didn't just need to make a statement. He needed to surpass a legend. To do this, he hires Horace Trumbauer, an architect who spoke the only language the super-rich understood, the language of absolute power. But here, the story takes an unexpected turn. Behind the famous name of Trumbauer was a quiet figure, the true genius of his firm, the chief designer, Julian Abele, one of the first great African-American architects, a man whose name, by the laws of the era, could not appear on the blueprints of the palace he was creating. What bitter irony! An architect who was denied a full place in American society was designing a symbol of power for those at its very pinnacle. The style they chose, Beaux-Arts, was no accident. It was an imported language of power, copied from the French palaces of the 17th and 18th centuries. Every portico, every column, every scroll on the facade was an encrypted message. It read, "We, the American industrialists, are the heirs of kings. We don't have blue blood, but we have money, which means we are the new aristocracy, and this is our Versailles." Parson wasn't just building a house, he was building a dynasty. He was commissioning a past he never had, carving it out of limestone and marble. His creation was meant to look as if it had stood here for centuries, impervious to time and doubt. He was building a fortress, but he failed to consider that the greatest threat would come not from without, but from within. The winter of 1927 was harsh. On January 8th, a cold Atlantic wind gripped the New Jersey coast. The first shadow lawn, a wooden giant of the McCall era, stood in the darkness, silent and majestic. It seemed eternal, indestructible. But deep in its basement, in the dark, a tiny spark in faulty wiring passed its death sentence, written in the language of electricity. Wood, the primary building material of that era, the material that gave these villas their warmth and charm, now became its curse. The fire, born in darkness, began to devour the structure from within. The caretaker, who barely managed to escape, could only watch helplessly as his life's work turned into an inferno. Just 4 hours. That's all the fire needed. 52 rooms, each a funeral pyre for priceless furniture, tapestries, and works of art. The flames devouring the symbol of an old era were visible for miles, painting the icy sky in apocalyptic shades of orange and red. By morning, all that remained of John McCall's dream was a smoking skeleton and $1.5 million in damages. But this was not just a fire. It was a purification, an exorcism. The fragility of its wooden structure was a perfect metaphor for the fragility of its first creator's reputation, John McCall's, which had burned in the fire of public scandal 20 years earlier. History, it seemed, was clearing the site itself, burning to the ground a past stained by compromise. And where some saw tragedy and ruins, another saw opportunity. For Hubert Parson, these ashes were not the end of the story. It was a blank canvas, the perfect stage to erect something even grander, even more audacious, and, as time would tell, even more reckless. For Hubert Parson and his wife Maisie, these blueprints were not just plans for a future home. They were a map to their immortality. Leaning over the enormous sheets of paper, they saw not lines and calculations, but the outlines of their own legend. This wasn't construction. It was a war against oblivion. The fire that destroyed the past had become his personal demon, and he was going to build a citadel that this demon could not penetrate. His main demand, repeated over and over, sounded like an incantation. The house must be absolutely fireproof. He didn't just want to avoid the fate of his predecessor. He wanted to conquer the element itself. He was obsessed. This was not just construction. It was the creation of a world in miniature, and he was its only god. He personally approved every doorknob, every shade of marble imported from Italy, every scroll on the fireplace screen. His finger slid across the blueprints, and every touch was a death sentence for the budget and a challenge to the laws of physics. For the architects and engineers, his perfectionism became a daily nightmare. Every one of Parsons' demands was a puzzle bordering on the impossible. How to hide thousands of feet of heating pipes and radiators without breaking the illusion of an 18th century palace. How to conceal the wiring for hundreds of electric lamps in walls that were supposed to look as if they were built 300 years ago. The house, not yet existing, was already staking its claim. It demanded to be not just beautiful, but invulnerable. It demanded to be not just large, but eternal. On paper, Parson was victorious. He had created the perfect monster. Now came the hardest part, unleashing it upon the world. Construction began not with stone, but with steel. Giant pilings were driven deep into the sandy coastal soil, creating a foundation capable of supporting not a house, but a skyscraper. And then, slowly, beam by beam, a skeleton began to rise from the earth. This was not the frame of a house. This was the skeleton of a leviathan. 600 tons of structural steel, more than many commercial buildings of the time. Workers, tiny figures against the steel ribs, connected them with red-hot rivets, and the sound of pneumatic hammers echoed along the coast. It was the soundtrack of a war. Hubert Parson's war against fire. Every beam, every girder was a declaration. The past will not be repeated here. Wood, which had treacherously burned in 1927, was banished. The new deity was fireproof metal. Experts watching the construction shook their heads. This wasn't residential architecture. It was fortification. Concrete and steel, materials of the 20th century, destined to serve as the shell for a fantasy of the 18th. Parson wasn't building a summer residence. He was building a fortress designed for eternity. He was trying to create something that neither flame nor time could destroy. But the steel skeleton, protecting it from fire, proved powerless against another, invisible enemy: fate. While workers were erecting indestructible walls, a bomb was already being planted on Wall Street that would blow up Parsons' own world. He was building a house to survive for centuries, not suspecting that he himself would only own it for a single decade. On the Shadow Lawn construction site, the America of the 1920s was on full display in all its complex, bustling diversity. The air was thick with a mix of languages. Guttural commands in Italian mingled with crisp orders in German and rolling Irish brogues. It was like the construction of the Tower of Babel, only this time, everyone understood each other in the language of craftsmanship. Hundreds of workers, many of them first-generation immigrants, were creating an American palace. Italian stonemasons, whose ancestors had worked with marble for centuries, were now hewing limestone from Indiana. Their hands gave shape to the stone drawn for them by the genius of an African-American architect. German carpenters, famed for their precision, created the intricate wooden structures for the interiors. Irish laborers, the muscle behind any great construction project, hauled beams and mixed concrete. It was an army, gathered from all over the world, to build a monument to a man whose fortune was built on their own cheap labor. Many of these men, after receiving their meager daily wage, would return home to wives who bought needles and thimbles at Woolworth stores. The money came full circle, returning to Parsons' pocket, only to be turned back into stone and steel. But this melting pot was not peaceful. The construction site became an arena for a hidden class war. Local unions, outraged that Parson was hiring cheaper European craftsmen, organized picket lines. They demanded jobs for Americans, creating a tension that hung in the air as palpably as the limestone dust. Shadow Lawn was not yet a home, but it was already a mirror reflecting all the contradictions of its era: globalization and isolationism, the immigrant's dream and the local's fear, the luxury of the few and the labor of the many. The palace was being built on a foundation not only of concrete, but of these unsolvable conflicts. While America, frightened by war and foreign ideas, was tightening the belt of isolationism, its wealthiest sons behaved differently. For them, the world was not a threat, but a catalog. And Hubert Parson flipped through its pages with the appetite of a predator. The construction site in New Jersey became the final destination for dozens of ships crossing the Atlantic. We can trace their route. Here is a vessel that left the port of Livorno. In its hold are tons of Carrara marble, quarried from the same white wound in the Apuan Alps where Michelangelo himself once chose his stone. Every cent left at a cash register in Ohio was transformed into a piece of a mountain, broken off by the hands of Italian workers. And here, a ship from France. It carries 200,000 unique roof tiles, each one molded and fired by hand. Its warm terracotta color was meant to give the American palace the look of an ancient European villa, warmed by centuries of sun. This was the globalization of hubris. The 24 fireplaces in the house became a collection of geological trophies. No two were alike. Black marble from Belgium, pinkish onyx from Morocco, green serpentine from the Alpine valleys. Parson wasn't just building a house. He was buying up the old world piece by piece, dismantling it for souvenirs and shipping it to his own backyard. The cost of these materials was astronomical, making up a significant portion of the entire budget. But the price was no object. For Parson, every piece of European stone was another word in his architectural statement. He was building a monument not to the American dream, but to the American ability to buy any dream, wherever it was sold. The old world provided the bones and skin, but for this body to come alive, it needed a nervous system born in the 20th century. From the outside, Shadow Lawn was meant to look like a dream of the past, unshakable, aristocratic, as if lifted from the pages of a French novel. But inside, it was a machine from the future. This house was a great deceiver. The main enemy of the illusion in the 20s was comfort, or rather, its ugly attributes. Cast iron radiators hissing with steam, bulky pipes crawling up the walls. They screamed of modernity, shattering the magic of antiquity. Parson declared war on them. For his engineers, it became the most difficult battle. They had to create an invisible empire. Thousands of feet of pipes and ducts were laid inside the thick walls and floors, turning the house into a breathing mechanism. Hundreds of ventilation grills were disguised as decorative elements in the baseboards and cornices. An entire subterranean river of hot water and warm air circulated through the building's steel veins and arteries, heating it from within, invisibly and silently. It was magic, conjured by engineer illusionists. But the pinnacle of this hidden empire was the telephone exchange. 75 lines. An internal network more powerful than those in many American towns of the time. From any of the 130 rooms, one could instantly connect to any other, to the kitchen, the garage, or to a broker on Wall Street. It was the mansion's nervous system, woven from copper and wire, a technological marvel that allowed the gigantic house to be controlled with the ease befitting a monarch. This invisible empire of technology was ready to serve. But it did not yet know that it would mostly be serving silence. There are luxury items that serve comfort. There are those that serve status. And then there are those that serve only the idea of luxury itself, taken to the point of absurdity. In the main hall of Shadow Lawn, that item was the organ. It wasn't just a musical instrument. It was an Aeolian organ, the Rolls-Royce of the music world, the pinnacle of engineering and a symbol of unimaginable wealth. Its cost, $125,000, was equal to the price of an entire street of decent middle-class homes. The installation of this giant was a construction epic in itself. Behind the carved wooden panels that hid it from view, workers installed a mechanism of staggering complexity. Thousands of pipes, from tiny ones the size of a pencil to gigantic ones capable of unleashing a sound that made the marble floors tremble. Each pipe was a voice. Together, they formed a choir capable of performing both a quiet chorale and a thunderous fugue. As craftsmen tuned its intricate internals, one could imagine what it was created for. For lavish balls, for Christmas carols, for concerts that would draw the entire elite of the East Coast. The music was meant to fill this enormous hall, reflecting off the high ceilings, welcoming hundreds of guests. But reality turned out differently. This organ, this quintessence of senseless spending, became a prophetic symbol. Its powerful voice was designed for a crowd, but more often than not, it was destined to play in an almost empty house. It became the voice of the loneliness that was already on the doorstep, a musical monument to a dream that began to die even before it was fully realized. October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday. On this day, American history split in two. The wall of paper money and stock quotes, which had seemed unshakable, collapsed, burying millions of lives beneath it. Panic reigned on Wall Street. Men in expensive suits threw themselves from windows. The future, which only yesterday had seemed like an endless party, turned into an endless line. A line for a job, a line for bread, a line for free soup. And 100 miles to the south, on the coast of New Jersey, the party continued. The construction of Shadow Lawn was in full swing, as if in a parallel universe where the laws of economic gravity didn't apply. Hundreds of workers continued to lay Italian tiles, polish marble, and hang crystal chandeliers. Every strike of their hammer was a defiant counterpoint to the quiet desperation gripping the country. The newspapers, which had recently marveled at the project's scale, now wrote about it with undisguised venom. Photographs of the luxurious facade were printed alongside images of the unemployed warming themselves by fires in the streets. The house that was meant to be an object of envy became an object of hatred. It became the most despised building in America, even before its lights were turned on. For millions of Americans whose modest savings had evaporated, Shadow Lawn was not just a house. It was an insult, a brazen, stone monument to the very blind greed that had plunged their country into the abyss. Parson was building his personal paradise, oblivious to the national hell unfolding beyond its walls. He was the captain of the Titanic, who kept on dancing after the ship had already been breached. 1930. The scaffolding is down. The dust has settled. The silence that replaced the roar of construction was deafening. Shadow Lawn was ready. It stood under the cold Atlantic sky, perfect, gleaming, and utterly lifeless. The camera slowly glides through its halls. Sunlight plays on the impeccably polished parquet floors. Specks of dust dance in the beams of light filtering through its 2,300 windows. Everything is in its place. Every fireplace, every chandelier, every doorknob. Everything is exactly as he wanted. Hubert Parson got his way. He had won. He had built the finest house in America, a monument to his taste, his wealth, his will. He had surpassed his father-in-law. He had created a masterpiece that was supposed to be the pinnacle of his life. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The stock market crash, which had seemed to him merely an unfortunate inconvenience, turned out to be a financial plague. Woolworth stock, the foundation of his fortune, had turned into worthless pieces of paper. The money had vanished. The capital that was supposed to fill this house with life, maintain its splendor, pay an army of servants, simply ceased to exist. And so he stands on the threshold of his creation, not as a victor, but as a future bankrupt. He looks at his palace, and in its cold beauty, he sees a reflection not of his success, but of his folly. The house was ready, but the dream was already dead. He had built the perfect stage for a party that would never happen. The history of this land knew a moment of glory. In 1916, when the first Shadow Lawn still stood in all its wooden grandeur, it became the center of the American universe for one summer. President Woodrow Wilson, running his re-election campaign, made it his summer residence. From its front porch, he addressed the nation. On its lawn, he accepted the nomination from the Democratic Party. In its rooms, a direct telegraph line to Washington was active as World War I raged in Europe. For a moment, this house was not just a house, but the heart of the nation, a place where history was made. The new mansion built by Parson craved the same destiny. And at first, it seemed it might achieve it. There were a few desperately lavish receptions. Champagne flowed like a river. An orchestra played in the grand hall. and the New York elite flocked to marvel at the eighth wonder of the world erected before their eyes. It was an attempt to pretend that nothing had changed, that the Great Depression was just newspaper headlines for the poor. But the masquerade could not last long. Soon, the music fell silent. And then, there was only silence. Life within its walls became its own opposite. To save on heating, the Parsons began to close off entire wings of the house. The doors to dozens of rooms were locked, the furniture covered with white sheets. The palace began to fall into a slumber, transforming into its own museum. It is said that Mrs. Parson, Maisie, would wander for hours through the echoing empty corridors. Her footsteps were the only sound in this kingdom of silence. The woman who dreamed of being a queen found herself a prisoner in her own Versailles. It was not a home. It was a gilded cage, a grandiose, cold monument to their own collapse, in which they were destined to live for 10 long, quiet years. 1939. 10 years had passed since the construction was completed. 10 years of silence, austerity, and slow decline. The time had come for Hubert Parson to admit defeat, but this surrender was to be his final financial maneuver. Then comes the most humiliating, most surreal moment in this house's history. We see a copy of the sales agreement. The lines, typed on dry legal paper, document an act of economic absurdity. Hubert Parson, broken and ruined, is selling his creation, the property into which he had invested $10.5 million, a colossal sum even for an era of prosperity. And the price of this transaction, $100. $100 for 130 rooms, for 600 tons of steel, for tons of Italian marble, for 200,000 roof tiles, for an organ worth $125,000, for the dream of his life. This was not an act of charity. It was a cold, desperate calculation. By selling the house for a symbolic sum, Parson could write off its entire original cost as a colossal loss on his taxes. It was the last attempt to salvage something from the ruins of his fortune. $100. The sound of 4 quarters dropped into the cash register of his own store. That is the value he placed on the monument to his pride. The dream of his life was officially declared commercially worthless. It was an unconditional financial surrender. The palace, built to declare the eternal power of money, was destroyed by its complete absence. Why did this house survive? Why didn't it share the fate of hundreds of other Gilded Age mansions, demolished, rebuilt, forgotten? The answer is simple. It was saved by its own monstrous gigantomania. It was too enormous for any private owner to afford in a war-torn America. It was too sturdy to be easily demolished. 600 tons of steel and tons of concrete were a reliable defense against the bulldozer. It was too majestic to be ignored. Its only chance for survival was to stop being private and become public. And it began its new life, reborn again and again. First, an elite school for girls, where the echo of children's voices replaced the resounding silence. Then, during World War II, its corridors filled with soldiers. It became a hospital, healing the nation's wounds. And finally, in 1956, it found its true calling. It became the heart of a new university. A building constructed as a monument to extreme elitism, as one man's fortress against the world, was transformed into an incubator of knowledge for thousands. Halls designed for balls became lecture halls. Bedrooms for aristocrats became offices for professors. We see shots from the movie Annie again. The same music, the same luxurious halls. But now we look at them with different eyes. We see not just the fictional palace of a kind-hearted billionaire. we see a real home, built on fear and poverty, that survived collapse and humiliation and found a new, unpredictable life. Ultimately, Shadow Lawn outlived its creators and their selfish ambitions. Stone proved more durable than money. Steel proved stronger than power. A building born from the pride of one man became the heritage of many. And in this lies its ironic, unforeseen, and enduring victory. The story of Shadow Lawn is a parable of how stone proves more enduring than money, and architecture stronger than human ambition. This house, born as a monument to personal power, outlived its creators to find a soul they had never imagined. But what if the true greatness of any creation, be it a house, a book, or an idea, lies not in the creator's intent, but in its ability to outgrow that intent and find a new, unpredictable life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories where the past questions the present. And if this story made you think, your support will help us create more films like it.